The Hormuz Strait blockade triggered a global oil shock, forcing some countries to adopt 4-day work weeks and even close restaurants due to fuel shortages. If the Hormuz Strait is further blocked, even more serious problems could occur in the future. Today, let's take a closer look at this issue. Let's get right into it. First of all, European countries are on high alert. The Hormuz Strait blockade has caused an aviation fuel shortage. The International Energy Agency's Secretary General told AP News that Europe has just 6 weeks of aviation fuel left, risking mass flight cancellations. By the end of May, Europe will have no aviation fuel left, and this warning is already becoming reality. German airline Lufthansa and Dutch airline KLM have already started reducing their flights. Lufthansa plans to ground all 27 aircraft operated by its subsidiary CityLine. They have also established an emergency plan to reduce seat supply by 5%. KLM has also decided to reduce operations for 160 flights next month. Scandinavian Airlines announced that it will cancel 1,000 flights in April alone. This problem happened because around 75% of aviation fuel in European countries comes from the Middle East. With the Strait of Hormuz blocked, aviation fuel is now in short supply. Right after the outbreak of the Middle East War, the price of aviation fuel in Europe rose by more than 120%. As a result, there has been a shortage of aviation fuel across all of Europe. From Korea's perspective, it's a bit of a relief. Although Korea doesn't produce a single drop of oil, it's the world's #1 exporter of aviation fuel. That's why aviation fuel stocks at Korean airports remain stable, with little difference from normal times. Korea is a country with world-class refining capabilities. In fact, its refining technology and production capacity are top-notch, as shown by its #1 ranking in aviation fuel exports. However, if you look closer at this structure, there's a fatal weakness. It's the fact that we can't produce even a single drop of crude oil. In other words, no matter how advanced our refining technology is, if we don't get the raw materials, the factories have no choice but to stop. The refining industry is basically a processing industry. You need crude oil to be able to separate it into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. However, if key transport routes like the Hormuz Strait are blocked, the crude oil itself can't come in. If this continues, refinery utilization rates will fall, inventories will drop quickly, and production will eventually be limited. We're managing with current stockpiled and contracted supplies, but if the supply keeps getting cut, it won't last. The main issue is the price. Even if crude oil comes in, if the price skyrockets, the cost burden for refineries increases explosively. This burden is passed directly onto the domestic market. The rise in oil prices leads to higher transportation costs, which in turn puts upward pressure on overall prices. That's why, although Korea may appear to be a country with strong energy production capabilities on the surface, its structure is such that it can be most affected the moment the supply chain is disrupted. If raw materials are cut off, all technological advances and production capacity become useless. Korea is also having problems with aviation fuel. Overseas airports are facing aviation fuel shortages. For long-haul flights to the US or Europe, planes must refuel both at departure and at the destination to return to Korea. If the other country's airport lacks aviation fuel, planes can't return to Korea. Domestic airlines have already entered emergency mode, and rising oil prices have greatly increased fuel surcharges. Starting from tickets issued in May, the fuel surcharge has been raised to level 33. To put it simply, until March, the fuel surcharge for a round-trip ticket from Incheon to New York was 198,000 won. But starting in May, you have to pay 1,128,000 won. It has become incredibly expensive. When the war in Ukraine broke out, it reached level 22, but now it's at level 33, so you can see how unusual this situation is. Actually, it's not just aviation fuel that's a problem. Fertilizer is also an issue. The Strait of Hormuz carries a third of global maritime fertilizer shipments. Its blockage has caused fertilizer prices to rise sharply. What's even more problematic right now is that fertilizer supply was cut off during the spring planting season. The reduced fertilizer supply lowers crop yields, also impacting the livestock industry that depends on grain feed. Consequently, food prices are predicted to rise sharply. Right now, in the case of Korea, the damage is somewhat less severe. However, if these tensions continue, it is expected that the impact will reach domestic agricultural product consumer prices by the fourth quarter of this year. The key raw material for fertilizer is natural gas. Natural gas is used as a raw material for hydrogen production, which is then reacted with nitrogen from the air to produce ammonia and combined with carbon dioxide to convert it into urea. However, as the supply of natural gas decreases, fertilizer production naturally decreases as well. The problem is, if fertilizer prices become too high like this, developing countries will face a really serious crisis. The price of urea, the main raw material for fertilizer, reached $725.6 per ton in March. It was $472 per ton in February, so the price is about 1.5 times as high. countries around the world have already taken emergency measures such as restricting fertilizer exports, and China is planning to halt the export of sulfuric acid, which is used to produce ammonium phosphate, the main raw material for fertilizer. Russia has stopped exporting ammonium nitrate, a nitrogen fertilizer. The UN World Food Program warns if the Middle East war lasts until June, 45 million more people will face hunger. The problem is, the spike in food prices will not stop there. Historically, whenever food prices have risen sharply, societies have become unstable very quickly. A representative example is the Arab Spring, which shook the Middle East and North Africa in the early 2010s. As wheat and grain prices soared, ordinary people's survival was threatened, making it hard to get even a piece of bread. In Egypt and Tunisia, rising food prices directly triggered protests that toppled regimes. The current situation is structurally very similar. The energy crisis has raised fertilizer and grain prices while reducing agricultural output. Countries with low food self-sufficiency are hit especially hard. Countries that rely on food imports have no choice but to bear the full brunt of rising prices, which inevitably leads to an explosive increase in public dissatisfaction. When this happens, government control quickly weakens, leading to protests and riots, and in some areas there is a real possibility that it could escalate into civil war. Because food is more directly connected to human survival than energy, when this problem arises, society tends to collapse much more quickly. Developing countries are often hit harder than advanced nations by oil shocks. Currently, the Middle East energy crisis is already affecting Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries rely on crude oil from the Middle East. But now that the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, there's an immediate shortage of fuel. Endless lines of motorcycles and cars trying to get gas at every gas station have become a daily sight. Due to the fuel shortage, public transport is reduced and rising logistics costs are driving up the cost of living. Currently, the manufacturing industry lacks fuel for power and operations, causing many factories to shut down or cut production. In the Philippines, diesel prices are up 59% and gasoline prices 27.3% from the same month last year. In the case of Vietnam, diesel prices have risen by 70% and gasoline by 17%. Considering that diesel prices in Korea rose by 17% and gasoline by 8%, the situation in the Philippines is truly chaotic. Southeast Asian governments are taking emergency steps to prevent economic collapse. To diversify energy supply, they began emergency import talks with oil producers in Africa and the Americas. In the long term, they are also working to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels by using renewable energy. In the case of the Philippines, they already declared a national energy emergency in March. They decided to stockpile 2 million barrels of fuel, refined products, and LPG. However, each country's current measures are just buying time. They are implementing all possible measures, such as releasing reserves, securing emergency import sources, reducing flights, and energy-saving policies, but the fundamental problem is not being solved at all. There is only one key issue. The key issue is whether the Strait of Hormuz remains open or not. Because the global energy flow is tied to this narrow strait, as long as it remains unstable, the market will inevitably continue to be shaken. The reason the current situation is even more serious is that the blockade is not constant. It opens and closes repeatedly, and the tension seems to ease, only to rise again in a continuous cycle. In this process, the market loses direction. Companies can't sign long-term contracts, shipping firms hesitate to sail, and refineries can't plan for raw materials. More dangerous than a supply cutoff is the ongoing unpredictability, made worse by the direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. With neither side having any justification to back down, military tensions and economic pressure are happening at the same time. Since either side would suffer a strategic loss by stepping back, it's difficult for a compromise to be reached easily. In this situation, even a small clash or an accidental incident could serve as a trigger to tighten the blockade again. The problem is that the longer this instability lasts, the more the damage compounds. A chain reaction is impacting not just the energy market, but also aviation, logistics, manufacturing, and the food supply chain. Companies delay investments, countries enter emergency mode, and consumers start noticing higher prices. If this continues, eventually countries facing an energy crisis will inevitably experience a major economic crisis, similar to the oil shocks that happened before. That's why the Hormuz blockade should be lifted quickly.